Hey guys, let's talk about sewing in bulk or mass producing any sewn item. Mass production is pretty easy to do, but there are a few important things to touch on before you really start rolling on your projects. The difference of sewing one item at a time from start to finish and mass production is that you would cut a bunch of the same thing out and then go through the pattern in a way where you're sort of shifting the instructions so that you're sewing all the steps at one time for one part, and then with the whole thing and all the pieces moving on to the next step. One of the most important things I can stress is simplicity and really being familiar with your pattern. So I would go ahead and read through an entire pattern, make sure that you're familiar with it, every part of it, make a prototype, make sure you're happy with the fit, and then really jump into the mass production. There are several reasons why you might consider mass production. Maybe it's the holidays and you're thinking about lots of grandkids or nieces and nephews and you want to sew some t-shirts, and you could make a bunch of the same t-shirt and then embellish them in different ways. Another idea would be for a craft fair, a show, or an Etsy shop, and you're working on making lots of the same items to have for sale. So whether you're doing them for gifts or for sale, it's important that you create items that are consistent and have a professional finish. So here are my 10 tips for mass producing or sewing in bulk. Tip number 1, get organized. Now, if you are part of Sewing with Cinnamon for some length of time, you've gone through the course that was all about organizing for productivity. If you haven't done that one yet, I highly suggest going back and finding that course, because we touch on all areas of being organized. And I think, as we all know, if you want to sew something, the things that stall you up the most or really just hinder you from finishing are finding what you need. You get going and then you can't find the right bobbin, you can't find the right needle, you lost the sleeve that you cut out yesterday, stuff like that. So, number 1 is get organized, be organized, and know where all of your supplies are and have a clean space to sew in. Tip number 2 is keep it simple. Be very familiar with the pattern that you're going to sew in bulk. So like I mentioned earlier, just make a prototype, check the fit, and really just be sure that you can sew it without checking and tweaking as you go. This is really important and will help you produce a consistent set of items all sewn at the same time. Along with that is simplicity of design. If you're going to sew in bulk, it's much easier to sew a bunch of t-shirts or even jeans, pants, something like that, than something that has a lot of intricate detail. You can still do that in a mass production style, but it's going to take a lot more time and a lot more attention to detail. So for your first project or your first idea for sewing in bulk, you just want to choose something simple that you're very familiar with. Tip number 3, choose your fabrics wisely. Work in a family of fabrics that all go together so that you're using the same needle, the same thread, the same tension, the same settings on your sewing machine, the same settings on your iron. All of those types of details are important for sewing in bulk. So if you're going to work with t-shirts and you want to do 2 sets of colors, you can just cut out your t-shirts, light colors, dark colors, and then you can at least use the same bobbin for each stack. You might need to switch your top stitching thread at the end when you're working on your final hems, but other than that, you should be able to use the same color thread throughout your whole entire project. Tip number 4, stack your fabric and cut through as many layers as you can at one time. This works best on a large table with a rotary cutter and a mat, and you can cut through several layers at once. Maybe you have 2 fabrics folded, so you have 4 layers of fabric, and then you can test the pressure of your rotary cutter. If you can cut cleanly through it, you might be able to layer 1 more piece of fabric on top of that. It just depends on the fabric that you've chosen. This method works great. It will help you be consistent and have your pieces all cut out the same size, and you can cut things out much more quickly that way. Tip number 5, don't use pins. I know this sounds wrong, but really it's much faster and easier, especially with things that are as small as the doll clothes, to lay your fabric out, put your pattern pieces down, and then use fabric weights or things that you have sitting around that are heavy, like a jar or a pin canister, something like that, even the pressure of your fingertips. but you can cut out that way. It's much faster than pinning down the pattern pieces. And then a lot of the seams are pretty short. So as long as you have your seams lined up and you're holding those with both hands, you can run those through the machine frequently without pins. Tip number 6, nip your notches to mark them. Don't cut triangles. This is super time consuming. So the easiest thing to do is to make small 1/8 inch slits into the seam allowance anywhere that you have notches marked on your pattern pieces. It's much more accurate to line those up than if you're cutting triangles anyway. So this is a good tip to use regardless of sewing in bulk or just sewing single items one at a time. Tip number 8, finish all the edges of your pieces first in one batch. So if you have a serger and you're gonna serge your edges, I would do that first. If you're gonna do it on your standard sewing machine and you use a zigzag or an overlock stitch, go ahead and do that first. Any edge that will be exposed should be covered in that way that you know you're not gonna hem or have a French seam or have enclosed with lining, something like that. But run that through and do all that first, and then you have all your pieces ready to go and you don't have to switch your stitching on your machine. You're just ready to straight stitch and assemble your garment. Tip number 8, don't be afraid to break the rules a little bit and reorganize your pattern instructions. If you're familiar with your pattern, you'll see places where you could combine steps or reorganize them to make things a little bit faster for mass production. Things like pressing are the one that comes to mind first. Generally, the instructions are written for sewing one item all the way through. So you sew a seam, you press it open, then you go and you sew another seam, and then you press it open, or you press it to the right, or you press it to the left. Something like that will really slow you down. So if you're working as a mass production style, I would sew as much as you can, all the straight stitches, and then anything that doesn't require to be pressed, it's not in the way of another stitch, just keep moving on until you hit a point where you have to press, and then go through and take all your pieces and do all your pressing at once, and then take it all back to your machine and continue with the rest of your project. This will really speed up your mass production. Tip number 9, invest in a good swivel chair or rolling chair. This is great if you have your space set up in a way where you could just wheel across or turn a little bit and go from a machine to a serger or a machine to a pressing area, something like that. So you can move much more efficiently through your space. It's also important to have good back support so that you're sewing and you're not hunched over and it's causing a lot of strain on your back or your neck. Another tip that I heard is to actually lift the back of your sewing machine just a little bit so it tilts towards you, and that will help reduce strain on the upper part of your shoulders and neck so that you're not hunched over looking down on what you're doing. It's lifted up just a little bit and then it causes you to sit up a little bit straighter. And tip number 10. This one's regarding buttons. If I was going to mass produce anything, I think I would avoid a pattern that has multiple buttons. Sewing buttons slows you down. Seriously, if I can avoid sewing buttons or snaps, I'll avoid sewing buttons or snaps. But here's a few tips for sewing them a little bit quicker. You can use 2 or 3 strands of embroidery floss to sew your button on and make sure that it's double threaded, and then you don't need as many loops through those buttons to secure them down. Another tip would be to use the setting on your sewing machine to automatically sew those buttons. That might seem a little bit intimidating, but once you get the hang of it, it will really speed up sewing buttons on your garment. I hope these tips have been helpful and you're able to think through how you might apply some of them into your work to start mass producing some items for yourself. Maybe you're interested in opening an Etsy store or just being more productive and efficient with the items that you're already making. It's a great time to really just think about the upcoming holidays, whether you're going to sell or whether you just want to make items for gifts. I think these tips will really help all of us to just come together and have a really good plan for making items in bulk. So now you have no excuse but to dive in and really get busy on your sewing projects. Over the next few videos, we'll touch on some other topics related to sewing items in bulk. So by the end of this course, I really feel like everybody will have a higher level of confidence and be able to sew and mass produce anything that they want to do.